The issues with trilogies, unfortunately, always has been the ending of the first movie and then the second film entirely. It's incredibly hard to write a good ending to the first film that is satisfying but amps you up for the second film. It's also really hard to write a second film that doesn't give too much towards the ending of the trilogy, but also has enough to warrant its own existence. I think there are many movies that fall into this trap, but there's also quite a few that don't fall into that trap. This video will not just be about what makes trilogies bad. I also specifically want to talk about trilogies that do work, but they only work because they're exemptions to the things that don't work. Trilogies of films must be kind of like having siblings.
I came out first. None of you would exist without me.
I came out last, so I'm gonna get all the awards.
That doesn't matter. There would be no coming last if it wasn't for me paving the way.
I had to wrap up all of the messes that you made. What the hell was the deal with all the chocolate pretzels anyway?
That's your problem, not mine.
I'm just really happy to be here. The chocolate pretzels were yummy.
Trilogies are on record as being some of the most hit or miss pieces of cinema. Sometimes they're absolutely incredible, like in my mind, Lord of the Rings, Back to the Future, the Dark Knight trilogy, or the original first 3 Star Wars films. Other times, however, they're the complete opposite. The Hangover trilogy, or like the Hobbit trilogy. I have always hated talking negatively about anything on this channel, especially as you see how movies are made, and you see how really hard making movies is. It's honestly still incredible to me that any movie is half decent or good. Clarifying there, if I have a review, it's not just because I'm not making every movie good, but if I have a review, I'll let you know if it's good or bad in my opinion. But I just don't like making long videos about negative topics, if that makes sense. There's a lot of negativity when it comes to the filmmaking YouTube side of the world, so I don't want to touch that too much. But with all of that in mind, I still need to tell you the issues with trilogies before I can tell you what I think the really good trilogies do that got over those issues. The issues with trilogies fall into 3 different categories. Maybe a trilogy of issues? Maybe from now on I'm just gonna do everything in 3s. I think everything's gonna be in 3s from now on. The first issue is, funny enough, making movies into a trilogy when they could be 1 or 2 movies to tell the same story. This is where, in my opinion, The Hobbit comes in, although it'll also play a role in this second issue here. The Hobbit should have been either 1 movie that's really long or 2 movies. 3 was stretching it out in my opinion. It has been a long time since I have seen these films. I should go back and watch them. I didn't like them when I watched them for the first time. But my issue with those movies is they take what is 1 book and stretch it out to fit 3 movies. This is a bit different because I think there was an expectation of a trilogy because of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The difference is, however, there are 3 Lord of the Rings books to adapt. There's a story in 3 separate books you're adapting. With The Hobbit, there's only 1 book. You can't really compare something like that when Lord of the Rings trilogy had 3 books to adapt from, and The Hobbit only has 1. It makes every single movie feel unsatisfying and not benefit a whole trilogy. This whole issue doesn't really benefit trilogies as a whole, because most of the time, the only reason trilogies succeed is because they only work as a sum of its whole, not for each film's individuality. So if you stretch out films that shouldn't be 3 films, it doesn't work, because a trilogy is defined by all 3 films as one package. The second issue is that in almost every bad trilogy of films, the second movie almost never succeeds in what it's trying to do. There are a few things that the second movie needs to do that we'll talk about later. The second film needs to be good enough to sell people on watching the finale to the trilogy, but also, the film needs to fit story-wise in this really strange position where they can't finish the story of the entire trilogy because they're not the finale, but they are also starting where the first film ended. So the pressure of the first film is falling onto the second film. But also, the film doesn't have the privilege to conclusively end almost anything, because you have to kind of end your film in a way that doesn't leave the third film in a bad place to start the next film and kind of end the whole trilogy. So you're stuck in this really weird place where the second film is kind of treated as a second place citizen to the other films in the trilogy, which is honestly one of the harder things for most trilogies to overcome. Probably the issue that regardless of how good the rest of the trilogy is, it will most likely succumb to this in some capacity. final issue that most trilogies will almost always fall into is the issue of failing to satisfactorily nail the conclusion to the entire trilogy and not just that specific film. It is really hard to do this sometimes, and I'm not denying that. Here's what I mean, and this is a very big issue that like a lot of movies tend to have, sort of most of the time actually. So here's what I mean by that, and this is a very big issue that a lot of movies tend to sort of have. So for example, a movie may introduce plot beats or foreshadow something that by the time the third movie has come out 5, 6, 7 years later, that they often just ignore or otherwise forget about entirely. So by the time the third movie rolls around, while the studios may have forgotten about it, everyone else didn't. So when the audience goes in and sees this film, they're thinking about that plot line that foreshadowed that otherwise the producers forgot about. And so now they're left disappointed because it didn't really conclude anything satisfactorily. It's what happens a lot of times when you just kind of make a trilogy without knowing what you're going to do with it. So we looked at the trilogy of issues that most trilogies of films fall into, that make them just not very good in the end or don't work very well. Most trilogies, in my mind, fix at least one of these issues, especially if I'm going to like the trilogy as a whole. Specifically, it's that third issue. We will go issue by issue on this terrible trilogy of issues that a lot of trilogies fall into. I think that's the last time I'll say that, maybe because I said it a trilogy of times. But for real, let's take a look at the first issue and see what can be done to fix it, at least in my opinion. Honestly, this first issue is probably the easiest issue that anyone can fix before even starting on the very complicated path of making a trilogy of films. First and foremost, plan things out. I don't mean say you want 3 films. Plan out the story when you are going to reveal certain pieces of information and the 9-act structure you are planning. This is no longer a 3-act structure, this is a 9-act structure. A beginning, middle, and end of 3 films that acts as one continuous piece of action. Being very careful in the planning stages of things when it comes to trilogies makes up for a lot of headaches later on when you're trying to wrap up 14 storylines that you simply cannot follow. And so, rather than trying to get actually some of the storylines wrapped up, most of the time studios try to resolve the entirety of the trilogy without having any context for how the film should have ended. When I think of this, I think of the newer trilogy of Star Wars films. They simply didn't have a plan on what the entire story was going to be. And so when you get to Rise of Skywalker, it's ultimately unfortunately unsatisfying, at least in my opinion, because you set up storylines that could have been satisfying, but unfortunately it failed because they didn't do enough planning beforehand. The Lord of the Rings trilogy, which may be one of the best trilogies of all time, was shot back to back, which I think really works, and I think why every film in that trilogy works the way it does, because it was all planned out. This issue is how, unfortunately, the second film of the trilogy can sometimes not be as good as the rest of the films in the trilogy, simply because of the way you have to present them middle film. I think there are 2 films that really work in some popular trilogies, and that would be both The Dark Knight and Empire Strikes Back. So let's take a look at The Dark Knight and how it kind of gets over this bad second film in the trilogy issue. So with The Dark Knight, I think the thing that the movie does better than other movies is that actually it's almost an entirely self-contained story that plays into the themes of the movie before it and the movie after it. It tells a story and concludes that story that it was telling you in that film, without stepping into the story of the 3 films altogether, which I think works perfectly to jump over that hurdle that a lot of movies fall into. The next film I want to talk about is Empire Strikes Back. Empire Strikes Back works for a different reason. Once again, telling a story that works alone in the film itself. But I think what this movie does that works for it is actually being the film that opens up the world. The first film is rather contained. It has Tatooine, Yavin 4, and the Death Star. The Empire Strikes Back actually has a lot more locations than that. Hoth, Cloud City, Bespin, the other Death Star, Dagobah, and really space is a bigger role in this film than it is in the first film. So getting to be the film that kind of expands the universe works because now your role is exposition to fill that third film, but also expanding the world and creating a more open universe for the stakes to be higher in that third film when it ultimately leads that direction. Those are the 2 best examples of sequels that fixed this issue. Honestly, this answer comes down to kind of the same answer as the first fix did. Planning your trilogy works. Not planning your trilogy doesn't work. I wouldn't start this video without knowing sort of what I was looking to do with this video. I just wouldn't do that because that would make no sense. Because otherwise this video would be totally incomprehensible. Banana, squash, peanut butter, mac and cheese, Lunchables, grilled cheese, Scream, Sunset Boulevard, Citizen Kane, Instagram, Facebook, CIA, FBI. However, planning things out and also not being afraid to introduce larger than the story types of plots and foreshadowing that can really destroy movies without much care at all. It's not hard at all to destroy a movie. This, however, can really be the big maker on how the trilogy is seen afterward, and whether or not the trilogy as a whole is successful. Because a movie with too many plots and foreshadowing that doesn't get tied up very well can be a real damper on the entirety of the trilogy. Trilogies can be some of the best storytelling devices we have to use. Other times, when they're done for profit, or because it might be kind of cool, trilogies are the worst. You tarnish name for profit when you should be worried about telling the best story you possibly can in the best format and the best way possible. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this very different type of film. It was very different and very, very hard to write and make, but let me know what you thought about it in the comments down below. I'd appreciate it. I thought this was fun. It was very fun for me to make, very different. If you're interested, you can follow us on all social medias, at MediaByteCo on TikTok and at MediaByte Company on Instagram. We are on Patreon, where you would get ad-free podcasts for $5 for every podcast, not just per podcast. Speaking of podcasts, listen to all the podcasts on the MediaByte Podcast Network. Slash It is for horror movies. Exploring Cinema is for all things not horror movies. And Diary of an Indie Filmmaker is for filmmaking stuff and all that fun stuff. So, thank you, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.